Hi, this is Wyatt Rice. You're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jam Along. I have a really special episode for you today, the first of two. A while ago, when I started putting together the Doc Watson episodes, I also realised that this year was going to be the 40th anniversary of Tony Rice's Church Street Blues record, which is my favourite Tony Rice record and just one of my favourite records of all time. So I couldn't let the opportunity go to celebrate it in some form. And a bit like the Doc Watson episodes, I started out and it's just snowballed. And I've been having some great conversations with people about this record. People who knew Tony, people who played with Tony, people who were inspired by Tony, all sorts of people. And this first chunk coming up is people who worked with Tony, knew Tony, kind of people who were close to him in some form. And the second episode will sort of go on a bit to explore the legacy of Church Street Blues and who Tony's influenced. And, you know, there's a bit of crossover, but I thought the rough groupings kind of worked. And so this episode, we're going to hear from Tim Stafford, who co-wrote the biography of Tony. We're also going to hear from Caroline Wright, who co-wrote it with him, spent time on the road with Tony. We're going to hear from Wyatt Rice, and this is, as far as I'm aware, the first interview Wyatt's done since Tony passed. And it was, that was quite a thing to get to talk to Wyatt. He was generous with his time. He was thoughtful. It was, just fascinating. I also talked to Mike Marshall. I've talked to Alison Krauss, I've talked to Bryan Sutton, and I've talked to Chris Eldridge, and you'll hear from all of those people in this first episode. I really hope you enjoy it. It's been astonishing, actually, getting to make this and to have these conversations, and it's meant a lot to me. And the generosity of the people who've taken part has sort of been a bit overwhelming. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you get as much out of it as I have. So we're going to kick off with Tim Stafford. I think this is a good one to start with for some just context. It's always a treat talking to Tim, and he's been enormously supportive of the podcast and really encouraging. And I'm delighted to start this with Tim Stafford. Here we go.
It is, and of course, the whole thing about Church Street Blues is that he said it was his hardest record to make because he had just depended on the band context for so long. And it was sort of terrifying for him to be on his own in that sort of setting, just sort of naked is the way he put it. And he said that he was suffering from pretty severe anxiety at the time. And that probably heightened his anxiety about doing this project because he had always been in a band situation in recordings. But he got through it, and that's probably why it was so hard for him. But it was something that Rounder wasn't interested in. At least Ken Irwin, when he talked to Ken Irwin about what he wanted to do and described it to him, and his whole goal was to sort of recreate the early Gordon Lightfoot records. That's what he wanted to do with Church Street Blues. And Ken said, well, this is not the direction we want you to take. And then, remember now, this is the time, too, 81, 82, and there where this is probably Tony's most creative, fertile time. He just came out with Manzanita, all these other great records, around the same time in the late 70s, early 80s. And, man, he was going to just get ready to start the Bluegrass album thing, which was supposed to be a Tony Rice Bluegrass album. And so it's a very fertile time, but Ken wanted him to do more things like the Bluegrass album, I think. I think that's what he had in mind for him. And who knows, man, they talk back and forth, and it may just be Ken's idea. Maybe all of the Rounders would have got together and they would have said, yeah, this is a great idea, Tony. So just in that brief conversation, though, Tony decided Rounder wasn't interested, so he went to Barry Claus. And Barry said, sure, man, let's do it. So the first time that Rounder was aware of Church Street Blues was when it came out.
No way.
So, and Tony said they weren't happy about it. But, and Wyatt had been coming to live. He had actually come out to California, which he'd been wanting to do for quite a while. Finally, Tony got him an airline ticket and said, come on out. And he stayed at the house there with Leela and Tony, and Tony was sort of amazed at how far he'd come in his guitar playing. It's just, you know, and it wasn't, I guess it was right before that. First thing that Wyatt did with Tony was backwaters, which, wow, you talk about getting thrown to the fire. I'm sure Wyatt can tell you more about that, but my gosh, man, I mean, that's Tony's favorite record, you know, and the rhythm guitar playing is just immaculate on that record. And obviously Tony didn't want to do songs like Gold Rush without a second guitar behind it because he wanted it to be a live record. And so he wasn't going to overdub himself, although I think there is one tune, at least on Church Street Blues, that I believe is Tony playing rhythm. Might be Jerusalem Ridge. I can't remember. But so anyway, you know, Wyatt ended up playing rhythm guitar on a couple of cuts, and some of the first stuff he ever did with Tony, and first things he ever recorded. Of course, he was a big Norman Blake fan, and that's why you got Orphan Annie and Church Street Blues on the record. I loved his version of House Carpenter. Oh, man.
Yeah.
To me, that's the most haunting track on the whole record. And I asked him specifically what version of that ancient ballad really inspired him. He said he had heard Gene Ritchie do it, but he said it was either Doc Boggs or Clarence Ashley's version. And so a while back, somebody asked me about this, and I went back and listened, and it was Clarence Ashley's version for sure. So, and you know, just little things from this interview. For example, as two guitar players, we're talking about playing songs in different positions. Like Cattle in the Cane is in the A position, and he talked about how he didn't like playing out of the A positions. It was very rare for him to play out of open A. He said he couldn't think of another fiddle tune that he did in open A. He may have done some Grisman tunes out of open A. And he liked it because of where the B section is in the minor chord. It's much easier to do there than to do a capo played in G with a G minor, you know, which is going to dictate a completely closed position approach to it. And also one of the things I thought was pretty funny, I asked him about the melody for his version of Gold Rush being different from Byron Berline's version. And he said, oh, hell yeah, it's a lot different. And, you know, in the very first phrase of the tune, Tony goes all the way up to the fifth note of the chord. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, Byron went to the third. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And I said, man, he said, it's radically different. There's barely enough there to be able to call it Gold Rush. I said, I don't know about that, man, but it's funny. Everybody does your version now.
Yeah.
You go to the jam session, you hear Tony's version, you know. And he said, yeah, I heard Byron playing it with Monroe, and I thought, this sounds really weird. This ain't Gold Rush. And he's the one who wrote the tune, you know. So just little insights like that I thought were pretty interesting on the material on Church Street Blues, which is, I think it's just a great combination of things.
It's a really interesting record for, like, not only the choice of the songs, but there's something in, you know, you listen to Church Street Blues, you listen to One More Night, Streets of London to a certain extent, and there's this sort of rhythm and melody at the same time, cross-picking thing that Tony does on that record that is just such a cool sound. And you wouldn't hear that with a full band, you know. It just gives it the opportunity to really shine out, and it feels like that's something you hear in his playing a bit more on the Skaggs Rice record, on some of the records with David Grisman. Just being able to hear the detail in Tony's guitar playing and things like that is just beautiful. It
is, and you know, the thing about Tony's playing is that a lot of his rhythm playing is so transparent. It's I remember a friend of mine, Audie Ratliff, who's a mandolin builder here in East Tennessee. Audie, at the time Church Street Blues came out, he said, well, he may have been talking about Skaggs and Rice, which came out a few years earlier. He said, can you hear the rhythm guitar on there? Can you tell what he's doing? I said, it sort of blends in, don't it? He said, I can't hear it. He said, I can't tell what he's doing. And that's just a testament to me to how well his rhythm blended in. But when it's just you got much choice, but you notice he does have a very light approach on a lot of his songs on Church Street Blues, to where, there's not this straight ahead hard rhythm that you hear. Even when he does that on that song you mentioned, One More Night, it's a pretty hard rhythm song. He's not really playing hard on it. It's got a really soft touch to it. And when you get to the cross-picking things like Streets of London and Church Street Blues, I think he's coming up with, he's doing exactly what Maybelle Carter did. She came up with a style that filled the space. George Shuffler did the same thing with the Stanley Brothers. You have this space because it's wide open. Maybelle Carter was the only instrumentalist. She had to come up with something that did lead and rhythm at the same time. In the Stanley Brothers, he was the Clinch Mountain Boy, George Shuffler. So he sort of had to fill the space, and the cross-picking thing was the way to do that. And that's what Tony's doing here, but it's an unusual thing. Like the roll on Church Street Blues catches your ear because it's got a timing thing in it that makes you think, now, wait a minute, where is that? Where did that go? It's got an extra loop in it that somehow fits back in when and every guitar player I knew at the time, and still to this day, you see it on the internet, they have to learn that thing. There's something about that roll on that. And it's not what Norman did at all. If you go back and listen to Norman's recording, which is, by the way, is amazing. I mean, it's some of the best playing. Oh my God. But it's based on this chordal thing that Norman did. It's hard to describe what Norman did because he didn't always play inside the chord. But I love what he did on it. And Tony's take is just so different. It's such a open thing with the cross-picked version of it. And you can tell that it was live just by listening to it, but especially when you go look at the Homespun video.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. To me, that sounds better than the record by far. And you get to see him wink, and play you folks a tune, and he winks, which is it's still one of the best Tony Rice performances in my book, is that Homespun version of the title track.
It's astonishing, isn't it? It's just and I think there's that thing, just the way Tony approaches some of those roles, and he doesn't alternate pick them. He just sort of sweeps on through with those downstrokes, and it's just there's something about the syncopation of that just it's unique, isn't it?
It is. And then that specific tone that he got when he used his fingers and the pick, which is something he explored a lot later on. He actually did it all through his career, but a lot of people didn't realize he was doing it. But in latter parts of his career, when he was called on to do solo numbers like Shenandoah live, he would use his fingers a lot with the pick, and it got this tonality that you hear. And I hear it there on Streets of London, particularly. I don't hear it on Church Street Blues because he's using the pick to sweep, like you said, all the way through the cross-pick and roll. And it's not a standard cross-pick roll. It's not a George Shuffler 2 down, 1 up, straight ahead, It's not a Clarence White alternating roll like he would do on, Farewell Blues. It's his own thing. And there's several phrases there that he uses all downstrokes on that roll, which gives it the tonality that can't be beat. It's because downstrokes rule, it's just the way it is.
It's really, really interesting to hear you saying about, it's a powerful sound, but he had quite a light touch at times playing it, because I've heard, it might have even been in the book when I read the book that you wrote, talking about other people trying to play his D28, the antique, and finding the setup quite light, and people really struggling to get a tone out of it because it just, it's not set up like your average bluegrass dreadnought would be.
No, and it didn't respond when you tried to hit it hard like you would with the dreadnought, because you want to hear it ring, on those D and G strings, pow. You want to hear that bluegrass power that's in most of those old dreads. Well, that guitar didn't respond to that. You couldn't really do that. You had to do a very light touch in order to hear that power. It was there. But Tony, and he had it set up exactly the way he liked it. It was almost like a telly, the way it was set up. It was so light. And he continually had Snubby Smith working on it, trying to get it set up better to suit his plan. As he got older, he wanted it even lighter action, but he didn't want it to buzz. So there's a real challenge there. And that guitar it's got overtones on it that are just really, really unusual. When I played it, I noticed that too. And you can hear it when Tony plays it. I hear those overtones. Part of what makes it sound like it does, But Tony would be the first to tell you, and a lot of the recordings from this period prove it, that it wasn't the guitar, it was the man, it was the right hand, because he did use an ovation on Manzanita. Backwaters was ovation and Santa Cruz, mostly. I think he used the antique on one or two songs. On that whole record, it's his favorite record, And I don't think he did it just to prove, hey, I can play this without this old guitar, which is obviously, and rightfully so, part of the legend Tony's playing, but it's so much in that right hand. It's kind of like trying to learn how to sign something exactly like somebody else. You're going to try to replicate John Hartford's signature, You can try to do that, and you can get some really pretty signatures that way, but it's not going to be John Hartford. It's not going to be, it's not that signature.
And it's not going to be you either.
Well, no, I mean, part of the thing that makes us all unique is our approach to what we do is individual, because we don't know any better. It's like Doc Watson didn't know any better. Obviously, nobody could show him anything because he couldn't see. So he had to go by feel when he did it. I'm sure that Mike Cleveland's the same way on the fiddle, Of course, those of us that have sight, man, we just learn how to do stuff. It's like Sam Bush playing from the elbow when he plays. Nobody else plays like that. But it's just the way that and what it did was it allowed him to do other things on the instrument that nobody else could do. And I think that's what happened with Tony. That technique that he developed with the thumb allowed him to get tone and do things with the right hand that nobody had been able to do before.
And I went on to ask Tim about when he first heard the record, which is a question I asked a lot of people during his interviews. This is what Tim had to say.
Yeah, at the time, I go back and listen to, or I think about where I was at in my playing and my life. I had been a Tony fan since the first time I heard him on the radio. It was from the Tony Rice guitar, or not Tony Rice guitar, the album, the 77 album that he hates, the first rounder solo album. I think it was Way Downtown. And I heard that and I thought, is that a guitar playing that? I couldn't even tell that was a guitar, And then it wasn't long after that I heard the Crow album, the 0044. And then not long, around the same time, I was just voracious trying to find anything I could about this guy's playing. I heard California Autumn, and that just blew me away. I just couldn't believe how good. And then I had a friend who had the first guitar album, the first solo album Tony did for the Japanese label that ended up being released on Rebel. I think it's called Tony Rice Guitar. Has Freeborn Man and 9 Pound Hammer and all that on it. And it had this like 10-minute version of Reuben, And at the time, that was what I was into, man. I really like these extended solo things and how he was getting some of the sound of all those different things that he did. And I used to listen to that nonstop. And I also was listening to Crow at the time because I had been a banjo player. And I got into Crow before I got into Tony. So, but by the time Church Street Blues came out, it was right before I went to graduate school. I was, or to PhD, work on my PhD in Miami University in Ohio. I went there in 84. So I was still at ETSU. I was working on my master's degree. And I was learning new things on the guitar and just trying to experiment a lot. And then I saw this record in the store, that's the way you bought records back then. And I had to get any new Tony Rice record. I had to get it, and I put it on not knowing anything about it. And then I realized it's just him, and I was mesmerized by it. I thought it was incredible. And it's one of those that, I didn't try to learn how to play any of his stuff, but I played along with it. I would put the record on and play the rhythm guitar, and there's something about Tony's rhythm playing, as we talked about before. It's just transformative, and then when you hear it playing with you, it's like it pushes you up, There's something about playing along with him that just puts you in that groove too. It's better than playing with a drum machine. It brings a whole new level of groove to it and feeling that you actually can fall into real easy. So I did that a lot, and came back to this album after a series of years and just was even more mesmerized by it. To this day, I can listen to House Carpenter, just get chills. There's that position that he played it out has a lot to do with it, but it fits the melody of the song better than any version I've ever heard. I've never heard a version that captures the melody and context the way that his rhythm pattern and the position that he plays does. It's ultra haunting, and I'm glad that this record's getting the attention it deserves, because I think it's one of his masterpieces. But you're talking about a guy that had a whole bunch of masterpieces, so it's hard to narrow down. You ask people what their favorite Tony Rice album is, you'll get about 25 different answers, but this one probably comes up as much as any, and it's definitely the most different of any of his albums. I think it's particularly interesting, though, that Tony was going through an anxiety crisis where he specifically mentions agoraphobia at the time. He was having trouble in crowds, which could be a death sentence for a professional touring musician at the time that he recorded this record. And it probably even contributed, like I say, to that, because it's just him, and he was terrified of that. He did seek therapy for it when he was living in San Francisco. He had biofeedback, and he said it made a huge difference. It actually turned him around to where he could function, as a road musician, and it got him much better. But this record came at a time when all that was happening in his private life that just makes it even more incredible.
It sounds like such a confident. It sounds like a document of such a confident musician who's utterly assured in what they are and who they are and what they want to say. It doesn't sound like, but that's often the case with musicians. Do you know what I mean? The expression of the anxiety is the thing that comes out most. Do you need to be expressing anxiety to be expressing something pure? It's the times when you're not making the music they struggle with.
Right. But when Tony was in the studio, man, it was still all about guided precision missiles. He was so locked into that, and he never deviated from that. His life, and his it was all about precision and trying to make it as good as it possibly could be.
So next up, we have Wyatt Rice. Wyatt not only is Tony's brother, Wyatt is also the only other musician to actually play on Church Street Blues other than Tony, and we had a really interesting chat about how that happened, a little bit of how it came about, a bit of the experience itself, just like fascinating stuff. This is, it's like getting to hear somebody who was part of history tell you about history. Fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed this one. Here comes Wyatt Rice.
I was trying to figure out a while ago, to the best of my memory, the timeline in which a lot of this stuff went down. And I always keep looking back, remembering that we had recorded Church Street Blues before the Backwaters record. But I could be wrong about that. But that's my memory of it anyway. There was a lot happening during that. I mean, everything happened so quick. You know, at the time, Tony, you know, he was just living in California. And I was living in Florida. So if I back up a little bit in time, he used to send me and my brother Ronnie, you know, tapes and stuff, you know, he would send us rough mixes on cassette to listen to before records came out and stuff. Even when I was about 10 or 11 years old, me and my mom and dad flew out to California to see Tony for a visit. That was really exciting for me at that young of an age, because we had a jam session the next night. He had David Grisman and Daryl Anger come over, and we had a jam session, and we're going to stay a couple days and then fly back. And then I asked my mom, I said, I'd spoken to Tony about it first. I said, man, I'd like to stay. He says, well, see what Mom has to say about it. Because I was supposed to go home and go back to school. And then Mom says, well, I'm going to talk to Dad about it. And he was a little stricter. So in the end, I got my way. I got to stay. And during this time, I actually got to stay a couple of weeks. I think Tony and my mom had a lot to do with that, talking my dad into letting me stay. So that meant me flying back home by myself. And I remember Tony saying, oh, he'll be just fine. Don't worry about it. He said, we'll make sure he gets to the plane. And so you can imagine, I'm just, like I said, 10 or 11 during this period. So after Mom and Dad left, Tony, like every day we went to like Grisman's house. This was during the time that they were rehearsing to do the first David Grisman quintet record. So they would have rehearsals at Grisman's house. And I was there for a lot of, all that. And at the same time, Tony was recording a solo record, one just called Tony Rice. That was on Rounder Records. It's the one that had a few songs on it I can remember, like Banks of the Ohio and the Grisman tune there, Rattlesnake. That happened first, and then I was just blown away as a kid about this new acoustic music. I kind of knew then, I said, man, this is what I want to do one of these days. So fast forward in time, when I turned, 16, 17 years old, I used to call Tony up and bug him on the phone. He knew that I wanted to play really bad, so some of the tunes, like I learned back then, was like one of the first ones is one he wrote. He showed me a few chords to it. Prior to that time, I just knew, some bluegrass tunes and flat picking tunes and such, and nothing too much about that music that I was so excited about. Anyway, yeah, fast forward to when I was 17 years old, Tony had called me. And I can't remember, like I said, I can't remember absolutely the timeline on this of which record was recorded first. I always keep remembering that it was Church Street. So I was so excited about it. I said, man, I've really hit it big time this time. I said, I'm going to go to a studio and record. So Tony flew me out. There was a lot of flying. I mean, like I said, a lot happened, man. I was flying back and forth, 2 or 3 times during those years, 1982. And I stayed out there with him for quite a while, almost a year or two. So, yeah, I fly in at the San Francisco, airport, and he picks me up, and we go to his place, and it all happened so quickly, He says, here's the tunes. He says, I want you to play rhythm on these tunes for me, which was Gold Rush, Jerusalem Ridge was one, and Cattle on the Cane. And there was another one that was a vocal tune that had to be the last one that was recorded. That was the end of the night. That's the last one he did on the record, was one called Pride of Man. And I wasn't expecting to play any rhythm on that. And this happened in a period of a short time span of, 3 days for the whole record.
Right.
If my memory recalls right. So I was just in heaven, man. I was so happy to be there doing what I was doing, even though if it's just, playing rhythm.
And the rhythm playing on that record is brilliant. I mean, it doesn't sound like somebody's first time in the studio, or there's no, the quality of the rhythm playing is, you can't imagine anybody else having gone in and done it better. It works perfectly on that record. It's astonishing to hear that was pretty much one of your first experiences of being in a studio.
Yeah. Like I said, I was like in heaven, doing this. And I didn't have a worry in the world. That I wasn't nervous or anything. Back during that time, I was just so excited about it. At the time, he was living in Corte Madera, California. And in his house there, we went, one night we had, messed around and played the tunes. Gold Rush, I kind of already knew. And Jerusalem Ridge and Cat on the Cane was one I wasn't too familiar with, but we sit there and practice, went over it a few times, and that was basically it. And then the next day we went to the studio and started recording it. And we'd record one or two takes of it, then that was it. And he would keep the best take. And it was all, live. It was no overdubs or nothing. So, very exciting.
And did it, sort of talking to other people about that record, it feels to people like it was really different from everything else Tony was doing at that time, to the extent that it said in Tim Stafford and Caroline Wright's book, he took it to the label and they weren't that interested in it. So he took it somewhere else.
Yeah.
It feels like, listening back for me, it's such a perfect record, but it feels like it was not what people were expecting.
Yeah, I recall some of that too, of him being on the phone, making phone calls to Rounder. And I remember him being kind of upset about it, although I didn't really say anything. I'm just in the background, trying to practice guitar. I had my own little room, but I'd kind of overheard some stuff, and he come out, and I was kind of asking him about it, and he says, man, and he was telling, me that they didn't think that was the right direction for him to take right then, was to do a solo record. They wanted like another bluegrass type record. He kind of he was a little mad about it. So I think he made something else happen. He made a phone call to Barry Paul's at Sugar Hill, and they said, yes, we'll do it, Tony. So, and that's how that came along. And so it always makes me think now, I think it's one of the more, all of his records are really good. But that one being a solo record, do you think that I know probably after it came out, I bet Rounder wishes now that they would have done it. So
Yeah, totally.
I don't know.
And a couple of people I've spoken to, like Bob, I spoke to Bob Minner about this, and a couple of people said one of the things that makes that record special is that Tony didn't really do another one like it. It's not like one in a long line of singer-songwriter style albums. It's special because it was a one-off.
Yeah. He already had, he had it planned out what he wanted to do and had it, he already knew in his head exactly what he wanted to do for that record. So, and previous records, and the ones after that too. He always had a in his mind exactly what he wanted to do.
And do you remember which guitars you used on Church Street Blues? I'm guessing Tony probably played the D28.
Yes, he used his D28. At the time, I had a 68 D18 I used on Church Street Blues. And I also used it some on Backwaters, too, with the exception of one song. Because on the Backwaters record, he used an Ovation on a lot of cuts, with the exception of 2 or 3 tunes. I know in the book it says 1 tune, but there's 2 other tunes I think he used that on the Backwaters record when he had both guitars there, but there's something about the Ovation. That's one of the first guitars, like when I showed up at his place that I seen, it was like the couch guitar. He had it laying up in his chair in the living room. And it's the first time I'd ever seen one. And I said, man, what's this? And he said, that's an Ovation. And he kept it all out all the time and was playing on it and practicing on it. So I kind of looked at it for a few minutes and then played down and I said, man, I want to see, where's the Martin at? At a young age like that, I didn't know what was going on with the Ovation. I just, it played okay, but it didn't sound like, a Dreadnought, or at least during that time period, I didn't learn until later on. And, it's what he's seen in those guitars. They real easy to play and they recorded very well. So.
And I guess if you've got 2 guitars going on at the same time and one of them's a D28, one's an Ovation, they're going to take up slightly different spots in the mix for each other.
Yeah. But he had a way of doing it with his, with his right hand on some stuff. You can't tell which one is which. Depending on what the tune is, I guess.
I think that's the thing, is that idea that the tone comes from the player. That's sort of the perfect example of it. If you can't tell if it's a Dreadnought or an Ovation, then that tells you where the tone's coming from, doesn't it?
Yes. For Church Street Blues, we had already recorded, I know the songs that I recorded on the rhythm parts had already been done. I thought I was finished. And he had done his solo stuff in there, and I was in the control room the whole time, just hanging out, watching this all go down. So, and when it came to the last tune on the third night, the third or fourth night, maybe, I can't remember. I'm going to say the third night because I believe it was 3 days. The last tune that he played was Pride of Man. So he went and played it, and he came in the control room after he finished the tune and got Bob Shoemaker to play it back a couple times. He says, you know what? He said, he looks at me, he says, Wyatt, he says, go in there and sit where I sit. And he says, my D28's right there. He said, get my D28. And he said, on Pride of Man, that song I just recorded, he said, when I take my solo there, he said, I want you to play rhythm behind me. So I said, okay. I had never played the tune before, but I'd heard it, in the control room. So I knew already knew in my head, I knew the changes already. So I sit down and just played the rhythm to that, what he wanted. That was one of those spur of the moment things that I wasn't expecting. So, but it worked out pretty good. I was pretty excited about that, and that's the last thing that went on the record.
It's amazing because it's one of those that you listen to now and people are still discovering that record to this day. And if you get people to list the records where everything's like, there's not a note out of place, everything hangs together beautifully, it's all perfect, it just sounds so together. The idea that you just sort of went in, picked up Tony's guitar and played some rhythm on a song you hadn't played before. And that's, part of that record.
Spur of the moment thing. He was kind of celebrating that the record was over, and he had a smile on his face in the control room when he looked at me. I'll never forget it. It's one of those things that always sticks with you. I thought I was really something. I said, man, I got to play on a record with my brother, and I was so tickled with that. I mean, I was like, man, this is great. And that time being 17, I'm thinking now, I said, golly, I got to go back to Florida and go back to the shipyard. It's like after doing this, something clicked in my brain. It's like, you know what, I'd already made up my mind before that, kind of, but this is like the icing on the cake after being in the studios like this. Man, I want to play music with my brother, Tony. And I said, I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen. After that, things started, he had other things going on. Like you said, the Bluegrass album band. And then it came to a point where he wanted to do a unit band and make a go of that. That actually started it out as we were going to do this duet thing for a little while and do a tour. And we actually did do a couple of shows up in Canada that were based off the Church Street Blues record. And it was just me and him at the time. And the Country Gentleman happened to be at one of the gigs up in Canada that we went to. And I think he had already been talking to Jimmy Gaudreau. They had been friends for a long time, since the 70s. But Jimmy Gaudreau had been playing, with the Country Gentleman. So we had this gig up in Canada. It was me and Tony playing this two guitar thing, and he was going to do, it was based off of Church Street Blues and a few other tunes. And while we were there, I think we played a few tunes, and then we took a break, and then he went back and asked Jimmy Gaudreau, he says, man, you want to get up and play a few tunes with me and Wyatt? And Gaudreau said, yeah. And then after the show, they talked more about it, and then the next thing I know, it happened so quick. Next thing I know, we got somebody that's booking shows for us. And then Tony had asked Jimmy, he says, man, a good bass player? And he says, yeah. He says, I know this guy named Mark Schatz. And so the next gig we played at, we got a band with Jimmy Gaudreau and Mark Schatz. And then that particular unit right there was formed.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com. I mean, that's an amazing few years.
Yeah. So, and that was really, really exciting times for me. All of it was. And I miss him dearly, so. Yeah, but Church Street Blues was a fun record to do and, you know, be a part of. And I'm glad I got to do it.
So next we've got Mike Marshall, who spent a lot of time playing with Tony sort of in the years before Church Street Blues. And again, it's always interesting talking to Mike. He's just full of insight and just, again, incredibly generous with his time, incredibly supportive. Just a joy to get to spend any amount of time with Mike in this way. And yeah, just full of interesting insights into Tony and into the record. And we kick off talking about 1750 Arch Street, the studio where this record and lots of other acoustic records that we love were made. And Mike had been back to visit it a couple of weeks beforehand with Bryan Sutton. And so we talk about the studio before we sort of get onto the record. So here's Mike Marshall. Oh, and I would like to just add that when I was recording this with Mike, we had some tech problems, particularly with the broadband signal at my end, and things dropped out and things got a bit messy. So I've had to edit this a bit. I've had to pitch shift some bits, I've had to get rid of some spaces, I've had to line things up again. It required a bit more work than some of them. But if there's any points where things feel a bit disjointed or a bit disconnected, that's entirely my fault, not Mike's. But I didn't want to not use this stuff. It took a lot of work to put it back together, but I really wanted to keep this in because it was a great chat. So yeah, here's Mike Marshall.
It was a legendary studio in many ways. In fact, it was very interesting being there with Bryan. He had never been there. And it's just this house. It's this old mission-style Spanish California house in the Berkeley Hills that had been a place where a lot of new classical music was being recorded. There was actually a label called Arch Street Studios that specialized in sort of contemporary classical avant-garde stuff. But it was just a home, you know, so it really had a great vibe. Wooden floors, really fancy, cool tile everywhere, and wrought iron railings going down into the basement and holding up the curtains. But the chief engineer there was Billy Wolf, who was an old friend of David Grisman's. And it's where we recorded the first David Grisman Quintet record was made there, as well as Hot Dog. And so Tony really took a liking to it, and he loved Bill Wolf as an engineer. Really great Neumann microphones and AKG mics all around. An old 3M mixing board, which was 1-inch tape, 8-track. So I'm sure this was recorded on that machine. So when you have 1-inch 8-track, you're actually getting more surface area per track than you do on, say, 2-inch 24-track. 2-inch 16-track is the same as 2-inch 8-track. But by that time, 2-inch 24-track had come out, which gave you more tracks. But sonically, the 1-inch 8-track was actually better sounding, although it limited you, quite a lot in terms of how many tracks you had. Only 8 tracks. When you think of how records are made today, where it's limitless. But the sound of that machine, and the fact that Billy Wolf took care of it so well, and I think Shoemaker was the other engineer who worked there. They really looked after these machines and made sure they were aligned properly. Tape heads were cleaned regularly. That made for a very special sound. that coupled with the kind of environment that you were recording in, it didn't feel like you were in a recording studio. It felt like you were just at somebody's house, in this really cool house, an old house from maybe the 20s or 30s. So it just had tons and tons of vibe, really nice oak trees all around it, flowers. You could step outside and just chill out. You know, you weren't in an urban area of town. Like a lot of studios would be in warehouse districts. You know, you walk outside and you're just on the street in San Francisco or something. You were in a real neighborhood. So I think all of that played into a lot of the magic that came out of that studio, whether you're talking about the first David Grisman Quintet record or Manzanita, the Skaggs and Rice duo record, this record, all of the Bluegrass album band records were made there. It just had a feeling, you know, and that's part of what I think made this great. But as I was saying, by the time this record came out, Daryl and I had long left the David Grisman Quintet. This is released in '83. I think that was about when we left. Then we signed with the Windham Hill Records, and we had kind of headed down a slightly different path from a lot of what we had been doing prior to that. And so I kind of came to this record later. In fact, I think it could have been 10 years after the fact before I really took to it and realized what a masterpiece it was. And what's funny about, I think we talked about this in our last interview, was that living in Germany now, I'm somehow drawn to American roots music in a way that I might not be if I were living in America. It's something that gives me a kind of linkage to my culture. And I sure find myself putting on all of Tony Rice's records. Of course, when he passed away, it was just like a bomb going off emotionally for myself and lots of us. And we spent a lot of time mourning his loss and just reveling in the greatness of what he gave us. It took months to recover from him passing, and lots of emails back and forth with people like Tony Rice and Bela Fleck. I mean, with Todd Phillips and Bela and Edgar and Jerry Douglas. I mean, just on and on, trying to sort of cope with it. You know, even though he had long since not been able to play or sing, I think none of us were quite ready for him to just not be around. So I found myself putting this record on a lot, probably because of the intimacy of it. Just him and his guitar. You really can hear the magic of what he created playing alone like that. So I went through it track by track, if you want to go that deep.
Yeah, I mean, what really stood out listening to it now? Was there anything that surprised you?
Not really, because in a way, you know, I got to sit next to him for hours and hours and really absorb it acoustically in a room. So I knew how wonderful it was, but I mean, his playing, you know, but when you listen to it, especially now, there were some things that stood out to me. One thing is just how perfect his playing is, of course, rhythmically and dynamically, and how in tune that damn guitar is. He just had a magical way of tuning the guitar. Never used an electronic tuning device. He would just bang that pitchfork on his knee and put it on the bridge and get that A note, and he'd go from there. Which is really a lesson for all of us who are so addicted to our electronic tuners. What was Tony Rice tuning into that perhaps we are missing when we tune so often with our eyes?
I was going to say, I spoke to Tim Stafford for this, and he said that, like, bizarrely, much as people talk about Tony's singing and his lead playing and his rhythm playing, one of the things that he was absolutely best at was tuning a guitar.
Yeah. No, it's uncanny how he dealt with that and how in tune he was with that guitar, how he knew how to temper it to different keys and different chord positions, and the capo and how much pressure the capo needed to have on it, and the action. He was constantly tweaking the guitar. Him and Todd Phillips were constantly working on it, throwing it on the bench and filing a fret or a nut or what have you. They even put, I think, a new fingerboard on it at one point, did some repairs on it. So he was just really in tune with what the guitar needed to be coaxed into perfection. The other thing that stood out is, a lot of bluegrass guitarists strum the guitar. And I think that we're, especially on this record, whenever he got into anything slightly intimate, I mean, he's just cross-picking all over the place in his backup, the way he backs himself up, strumming. It's not really strumming. It's a combination of strumming and cross-picking. And it's an extremely unusual pick direction decision-making. There's lots and lots of double downs, double and triple downstrokes, which most guitar players today, except for Wyatt, I think he's the only one who's figured out Tony's right hand, that it's a series of double downs and that give a certain kind of sound to his to the way he just would do that nobody else can get. You can't get that same sound with alternate picking.
That sort of first track, Church Street Blues itself, is the perfect example of that. If you can pick something pretty similar with alternate picking, but the rhythms and the little sort of inner movement of that is entirely down to the way he picks it, isn't it?
It totally is. I mean, I made a few notes here. First note was perfect. Second note was cross-picking all over the place. Next is the word relaxed. Next is there's a folkiness to it. It's not driving like so many bluegrass people think bluegrass has to have drive. It doesn't have drive in that same way. You have this incredibly intimate, close mic'd studio sound in tune with a capital, all capitals with an exclamation point, never overplaying. There's a way that the groove floats in his hand where he's not having to over coax the groove. He's barely touching the groove. It's actually floating by itself. And it's very far from metronomic. It's elastic. I like what he said. He talked about Todd Phillips talking about the drive in bluegrass having a feeling of a train, but it's also got something inside of it. If you picture a drunk hobo inside the boxcar kind of wobbling around. Yes, the train is going metronomically down the tracks, but there's this other thing internally that has a sway to it.
Yeah, it's and it feels so completely relaxed, as you say, and completely as it should be. The complexities of it sort of pass you by initially because it just feels like every beat is exactly where it's supposed to be, and so
that's it. It doesn't have any of that feeling of anxiousness that we so much associate with bluegrass when we think of it as drive. Yeah, I guess he was one of the first. I mean, he's coming from a tradition of the especially around the D.C. area where bluegrass musicians were were kind of starting to do cover tunes, for instance, of folk songs or even pop songs. So that, he's coming from that legacy of the seldom scene and the country gentleman, where there was a softness starting to appear in the music and an appreciation for whether it's Joni Mitchell or Paul Simon or James Taylor. And so he's tapping into that kind of relaxed gentleness and applying it to a deep traditional bluegrass background.
Yeah, and that rhythmic thing, I was talking to Chris Eldridge about this when I spoke to him, and we were sort of making the comparison between like a rock drummer who does kind of, bass drum, snare drum, bass drum, snare, and a jazz drummer who floats with like a right hand and a left foot, and everything else is sort of commenting and accenting. And Tony feels much more like that as a rhythm player than a sort of like the way Doc Watson would play rhythm, for example, which is much straighter.
Well, certainly we know how much Tony listened to jazz recordings and how much he loved jazz, especially drummers, bass players. So there's no doubt that that's found its way into his right hand in a very deep way. I mean, we used to play together, and we had a band called Ukanim, which was a kind of the bad boys of the David Grisman Quintet, sort of skipping class and going out behind the school and poking fun and pushing at the boundaries of what may have been allowed in David Grisman's band at the time. So we were experimenting with all of that stuff, all those very outside rhythmic syncopations, as far out as we could get, crossing the groove against each other. It would be Todd, Daryl, Tony, and I, and we called it Zeet Booba. Zeet Booba. Just sort of pineapple upside downing the stuff to death, and seeing if we could still stay in that groove, and not lose a beat, no matter what somebody was putting across it.
And that's the fascinating thing about Church Street Blues, is because all Tony, apart from the tracks Wyatt plays on, all Tony has to respond to is sort of himself and the song. There aren't other musicians but he still manages to, it's still very reactive live playing.
Well, that's true, and it's something that I kept commenting on in my notes while listening to it, was that here he is playing alone, and he's got to maintain a certain stability to everything. If you just check out his low notes on the guitar, I mean, throughout the whole record, he's hitting downbeats, pretty much root fifth, very strongly, because I think he's aware, that the listener needs that to hold on to. Here I am playing alone. I got to be the bass player, probably first. And then I'm going to try to fit this other stuff in and around that. But I'm not as free as I would be if I were playing in a bluegrass band. I wouldn't have to be hitting those downbeats quite as consistently because there is a bass player. So he's covering that, and yet he still is free with the other parts of the upper strings. That's pretty remarkable. If I look at my notes on, say, Streets of London, well, there's a few things that jump out. If I could change subjects here, I go to, there's an honesty in how he's singing, almost naivete thing, but it's never overly sentimental or cloying. He's giving us his heart full on, but it's not. I really feel like we get inside of Tony on this record in a way that you would never get with the Bluegrass Album Band, for instance.
Yeah, and for somebody like me who didn't see him play live and didn't sit next to him and hear him in the way that you did, it's the most complete chance to feel like you're sitting in a room with Tony Rice playing guitar and singing you a song. And I think that's part of the magic for most people.
Yeah, it's this. He's very calm in himself in a very centered way, which is really odd because in reality he wasn't like that at all. He was a bundle of nerves. He was extremely uncomfortable around people, and really hard on himself in recording sessions, in trying to attain perfection. So that created a kind of tension in his music making, and yet on this album you don't feel any of that. I mean, most of his records he somehow overcomes that. And in this record in particular, it shines a light on how relaxed and calming the sound is that he's creating, which is very interesting, coming from somebody who was kind of a wreck.
Yeah, Tim, Stafford and Wyatt both sort of said that around the time he was recording this record, he was particularly suffering with anxiety and agoraphobia. And you listen to how relaxed it sounds and how assured and how completely settled as a musical performance that record is. It's astonishing.
Well, perhaps, playing the guitar and singing was the one place where he could control everything. And it was the one place where he felt at ease. It could be that. I don't know. I mean, I like what Tony says when people are trying to ask him about why something is so great, and he just says, when it comes to music, there are some things that are just mysterious that we'll never understand. And certainly him as a musician and his playing and the way he played rhythm, it occupies that territory for me, You cannot dissect it down and figure it out. If somebody transcribes the entire guitar part on Church Street Blues, and you can watch the video of them so you can match those pick direction things that he's doing, it's still not going to sound like Tony Rice, Oh, no way, right?
Yeah, and it is that, it's this interesting point that maybe that, because perfection is a word that crops up again and again when people talk about Tony in all aspects of his life, and just attention to detail. And if that's, I guess sometimes if you could explain what you do and you could totally pin it down and dissect it for people, maybe you wouldn't need to do it. And that's part of the compulsion with people, is it's a way of expressing something there isn't another way to express.
There you go. Could be that. I have a note here for folks to listen to the high strings above the melody lines when he's playing the guitar. He's just barely touching them while playing all this other shit below on the low strings. It's absolute magic. He's just barely touching the high strings. Most of the solos are occurring on the lower strings. But just by hearing those tiny bits they're just like little sparkles. And he never kills the endings of the songs. There's always this gentleness to the last chord. Gorgeous.
It's really interesting what you were saying before about that sort of Washington, D.C. scene and the sort of bringing some softness to the music, because there are also quite a few major key songs on this record. They're not all sort of hard driving kind of flat seven type feels, with things like One More Night, Church Street Blues and Streets of London. There's
House Carpenter. Yeah, it's a softness, a gentleness, an understanding that you're trying to relay a story. It's a real folk tradition of telling the story in the song. He seemed to really understand that, and he chose material with a message. We focus on his guitar playing a lot, but he picked really cool songs. It reminds me of J.D. Crowe talking about when they were playing in Lexington every night. They'd get home at midnight or 1 a.m. and then stay up till 5 a.m. because all Tony wanted to do was like either jam all night or put on all kinds of records and listening to all kinds of music, pop music and folk music, and probably just appreciating, like looking for material, I guess they were doing.
It's a layer of this record that so it hadn't really occurred to me till I started talking to people about this record, because obviously you listen to it and the singing is astonishing and the playing is astonishing and the sound of it is astonishing, but I hadn't thought about this sort of song choice, and that in itself is a fascinating angle to approach this record from, because Tony is not known as a songwriter. He's written some stuff, some tunes and things, but he's not a writer as much as a kind of accumulator of songs in the way that Del McCoury or Doc Watson do so well. And it's just fascinating to hear what he puts together as a little journey for you.
Yeah, especially somebody who's such a good guitar player. It's rare that they would be so attuned to that part of music making. It's just an unusually deep cat with a broader goal than just being a flat picker. You just never get the feeling, even though everybody's jaws are on the floor to the guitar playing, you just didn't get the feeling that he's doing it for that reason, So anyway, the material, choice of material was really great, and he knows how to deliver a message. Also, I have a note here that he knew how to pitch songs for his voice. There's very few real high things on this record, high singing, but Last Thing on My Mind has a few parts where he has to go to that really high part of his voice. And I love it. And I'm guessing it's very intentional. He knows his range and he knows what kind of emotional thing he wants out of a song. And he probably knows when he needs a wider range of material for an overall record. But these high parts of his singing, and especially in Last Thing on My Mind, it's almost... I remember thinking this way about the record with Ricky Skaggs. When you listen to that thing with headphones and he hits those high notes, it's like wood cracking. There's some other harmonic that appears in that part of his vocal range where it's like, oh God, what is that sound? It's like a pop. Very interesting.
There's a note in One More Night, I feel, is the same way as well. And you get the sort of, it opens with what is nominally the chorus. I'm not exactly sure what the structure of that song pans out as if you write it out. But then there's that second section that it goes to, and the first note of that is pretty up there. And it just rings out, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it also creates a little bit of tension, which this record doesn't have much of. But that's a part. I have a note here. Some tunes needed that, so he knew to pick keys that would push him into that range.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're totally right. That sort of relaxed quality of this record, the way he introduces tension. So there's bits like House Carpenter, the tension comes from this sort of unresolved chord that goes all the way through it. Mm-hmm. That is just a suspended thing throughout. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of tension. It's a gentle sort of tension, but it's also tension.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's getting into his jazz side of things, I haven't gone back and listened to the original of that, but I don't think it had that chord in it, right?
It's interesting, isn't it, that you were talking about how Tony sang those songs, and it's pretty unadorned. There's not, much sliding around or much kind of embellishment. It's just a voice coming at you, pretty honestly. Yeah. He doesn't force the storytelling. He doesn't tell you how to... Some singers sing in a way that...
He never says, check out how I'm singing this.
Yeah.
It's never really about him in that way, that some singers are always doing the tricks or doing some slidey thing or getting some gravel going or whatever it would be. It's very me-centric for some singers. There's a kind of humility to the song that he carries that reminds me of people who are really great at playing Bach would be sensitive to. it's a little bit of just play the notes. Don't try and teach us anything about how great you are. The composer's wonderful. All you have to do is get out of the way.
Yeah, it's really interesting because so much music, particularly popular music now, people are very keen for you to know how good they are. They're telling you, they're showing you, they're signposting the goodness in their singing. When you don't need it. If it's good, you'll notice it.
Exactly. Well, Tim O'Brien certainly has that quality of just, you're just sucked right into the song when he opens his mouth. And he was inspired by Tony a lot. So yeah, no pyrotechnics. Although to do what he's doing is incredibly pyrotechnical and full of fire, and you could get burned. It's like he's walking on a tightrope the whole time and doing the impossible. Those of us who attempt it know just how difficult it is.
My next guest on this episode is Alison Krauss, who I can't imagine needs much introduction for most of you. Alison spent some time playing with Tony, and Tony spent some time playing in Alison's band as well. And we chat a little bit about that and about the record, and yeah, just such an interesting conversation, and just talking to somebody who Tony and Tony's music clearly means so much to, was an honour. Here comes Alison Krauss.
When I would listen to Tony's records, you have an idea of who you think that person is, and the character that comes to your mind. I was, 12, 13 when I first was hearing his music for the first time, and I grew up with playing with two very good songwriters that were in the same band, John Pennell and Nelson Mandrell. And so in that process of, being around when they were agonizing, not Nelson as much, but John very much agonizing over his, word choices. And when I mean agonizing, I mean the deliberateness of it and the passion in having something be said so distinctively and so agonizing maybe is a good word for it, but not in the negative sense, but in a perfectionist sense, or someone striving for something excellent. He and I would drive around and listen to Tony's records, and when someone chooses a song, just like Tony was so connected to Gordon Lightfoot, that personality that those songs had with him, then, it produced a character you think you know. And I think there's such a romantic part of your whole presentation that comes from what words you choose to say that come out of your mouth, when you're singing, that it's lyrically, it's so important. Even a lot of people don't even listen to lyrics, but I think it can't help but get in there. So, and I'm not a songwriter. I may do a little bit of editing or make some suggestions on a title or a subject, to people that I've worked with a long time. But I'm fascinated by that gift. I've always been. I think it's as powerful as any gift on earth, really, that ability to put poetry and melody together that change somebody's whole state of mind after it's turned off. So I think Tony, for me, and so many thousands of people, that character that we saw him as being so heroic and romantic at the same time, there's just no match for it. And then to combine it with how he presented himself, there's just nothing like it to me. Nothing, no and how he sequenced his songs, and it's funny because you think you know what somebody's doing and the intent that they have behind it. I didn't get to talk too much to him about all of that. Through the years, you don't sit down and go, what was your intent? You don't get a chance to do that. And I think his stuff was probably much more off the cuff than I realized. But it is sure, I don't even like to get the records out too many times later in life because I don't want to lose the feeling they gave me. When you hear something again, I have to choose carefully so I don't mix my feelings up with now. I want to have those old feelings connected to those records, if that makes sense. I want it to take me back, so I save it.
It's interesting, isn't it?
That makes any sense.
No, totally. I think when you hear a record can have a massive, really profound effect on how that record affects you, the time of your life and what your circumstances are, and particularly with lyrics. You say a lot of people don't listen to lyrics, but if you do, the lyrical content of a song could hit you like a truck on a particular day when you feel a certain way, and maybe 5 years before you wouldn't have felt that way about it.
And, even though you may not necessarily be listening to what the lyrics are, it doesn't make it any less true. It's still true whether or not someone's paying attention or could recite it back.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things about Church Street Blues, because it does have some fiddle tunes on it, but it is very much a selection of singer-songwriter kind of material at a time where Tony was sort of largely known as somebody who played in band contexts. And it's that ability to hear Tony just sit there with a guitar that makes Church Street Blues really magical.
Yeah, him being so exposed. Though I heard that record later after I first heard the Bluegrass album band stuff, and that's what my friend John Pennell would play and gave me tapes of. He'd make cassettes of stuff. And Church Street Blues I heard later. So to hear him so exposed and to see those, you've seen, I'm sure, the guitar lesson, I think it was on Homespun.
Yeah.
Where he played tunes like that. And, he was just such a mystery to us. And then to have him so exposed and him become more mysterious is, I think there was as much wondering who he was as there was trying to figure out who he was. You liked, you liked wondering just as much.
Yeah, maybe that's the appeal of that record, is because it is largely just Tony. You get a bit more of a, and because he, obviously I didn't know Tony, but that so many people talk about him as being a little bit elusive and a bit hard to reach. And so with such an exposed record, it makes you really want to lean in and listen to what he's telling you, because you can hear all of it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something, look, that record, the singing is as good as on anything he's done, and you really get to hear that as well. Yeah,
it's beautiful. I love House Carpenter, and I loved Edmund Fitzgerald, and now his singing, you couldn't tell where he was from, and no one sounded like him. I mean, I've heard, Nate Bray from the Bray brothers. He did favor his voice to me. I thought some, but no one could really grasp that, and I guess that's where those songs come in, and it's I don't know if anybody. I've had conversations hours and hours about what we thought Tony was, or how he might have thought about something, and I just recently found him talking at a workshop in 1986. And do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
from the Strawberry Festival.
Yeah. Yes,
that's the most I'd ever heard him. This is just like last week, and I'd never seen this of him talking about music and playing, and I mean, it was fascinating. And I wrote John Pennell. I'm like, you got to watch this thing of him talking, about, unfolding his whole thought process, which I never got to hear too much about it. And it just seems very natural. Then at times he seemed to be more deliberate and what he was talking about. It's hard. I always have imagined what those studio sessions were like, and I really have no idea. And then if I found out, I don't know if I'd want to give up my thoughts, what I thought it was like.
It's funny, isn't it? You like you said at the beginning, you sort of build a picture based on all of this, and it obviously is true, because if somebody's an artist and they're communicating themselves to you, like, the picture you have is correct, but it's also from a particular angle that may, and then if you see a different light shone on it from another angle, it's a different thing entirely, and we can get quite protective over our pictures of people whose music we love.
That's right. Whatever my picture is, it may or may not be true, but I sure like it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you saying
really like it.
Yeah, and I think Tony provokes that in people more than most do, and maybe it's partly the elusiveness, but I think there's something about the way he expressed it in everything. So, like, the music was very, very deliberately thought about and detailed and intricate, but so was the fashion and his choice in cars and watches, and it seems like everything that he did, if he decided something was worth doing, it was worth doing.
Yeah, I would think someone that particular isn't only going to be particular in one area. Usually they got all kinds of stuff, that they're pretty specific about. But yeah, I didn't know him. Just he was very. I played with him some in the late '80s, and was around him a bit then. But he was, pretty to himself then as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why people love Church Street Blues, because it's the nearest you can get to feeling like you're sitting in a room with Tony just playing a guitar for you. It still has that. I do listen to it regularly. It's not been in my life for that long, a few years really, and so to sit there and put the headphones on and just get lost in it, like you're sat next to somebody telling you a story. It's a beautiful thing.
Stunning.
And after chatting a bit about the record, we also went on to talk about a couple of times Alison got to spend some time one-on-one with Tony and how that was. So here's Alison talking about the time she spent with Tony.
Well, a number of years ago, first in the 80s, I had a permit, and a driver's permit, and I didn't have a driver's license yet. And we had played in Baltimore, but we were all staying in Washington, D.C. And so he's like, Krauss, you drive. I'm like, oh, gosh, I got a permit. Yeah. So I drove him back to the hotel where we all were in D.C. And on that way back, he played, Benny Goodman and who's the guitar player? But he played another few bits of music that he loved, and he's like, listen to that, listen to that. And I'm like, more scared of driving. And that was just kind of a, cool experience to get to talk or hear what he liked, in any way about anything. Because I always used to wonder what he listens to when he's, you don't know what someone likes. And then years later, and I think it was 2005, we did a tour with Tony, our band, and we did all his songs because he had been doing that, having different people come sing the leads on stuff. So he did a tour with Union Station, and we did all that. And Jerry says to me, he goes, "There's 2 tickets to the symphony. Go get Tony and take him to the symphony." And I'm like, I don't want to take him. I don't want to do it. He's like, take him to the symphony. And so, and at this point, I can't remember how old I am, late 30s or whatever. And I pull up to the hotel, and he's standing out there. He goes, "Hey, you remember the last time you drove me? You remember the last time you drove me somewhere?" And I'm like, I do. I was hoping you might have forgotten. But we did. We drove to the symphony, and he talked about the guitar and not singing anymore and what that was like. And, just that's probably the only, those 2 times or the times I had any kind of private conversation where, he shared what he thought about playing. what he felt about what he heard and just about his own things. It was really magical. I'll never forget those bits because it was, a special time, even if it was for one time, maybe a little longer driving the car there, but another 10 minutes to the to the symphony. It's special to hear somebody you admire so much, even to say they like something. And while we were at the Symphony Hall, it was Edgar Meyer and a really beautiful piano player. And there was one moment that they were playing, and I remember it was so stunning, I held my breath. Like it took my breath away. And at the same time, he goes, like this. And I went, oh my gosh, I like something at the same time. Whatever. It's silliness, but real. Was proud of myself for liking something at the same time.
That's lovely.
It was a moment.
It's funny how many people talk like Chris Eldridge talks about spending time with Tony when he was at college and not really ever picking a guitar up, just talking about things and listening to things, and that being more important than where you put you. So you're talking about him, about Tony sort of talking at the festival in that workshop. And I would rewatch the Homespun videos, and they're great. You can just sit and watch them. You don't need to even pick your guitar up. They're just fascinating documents. But you can sort of see that he sort of struggles sometimes to talk about what he does. And Happy's sort of saying to him, can you play that a bit slower so we can see what you're doing? And he's sort of gone, you can almost see him wanting to say, I don't really know how I do that. I just do. That's how I fix that problem. And it's like, that's in my fingers. I don't know. And it's elusive stuff. And so those moments where you do hear him talk about it and sort of find the words and find a way of, they're really magical.
Yeah, any look into that character is pretty fascinating. Because there's not a very it's not an open door, really, is there?
No, and that makes you want to lean in even more, doesn't it? I think any kind of personality or art that doesn't just run up to you and kind of introduce itself, that makes you lean in and step in and do a bit of work, and they're always a little bit more intriguing.
Yeah, I always found, he's one of those people, and the records, you end up with more questions at the end of it, and you just want to understand more, and you don't get to. And when he passed, there was so much hope for so many people that he might sing and play again on some regular basis, and that was a really hard blow to know that was over. It really was devastating, like that hope was gone.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with any kind of artist who passes suddenly or before you expect them to. It's just the loss of the art, because most of us don't know the human. Like, I obviously never met Tony Rice and never would have done, but just to know there's no more music coming when the music is so precious.
And no more music coming, but then everybody was just, I felt like always rooting for him to be able to heal his voice, and that someday it was going to come out again.
And I think one of the beautiful things that did happen after he passed was just the outpouring of celebration of what there was and what we did have and what we did know, and just so much kind of celebration of the music and of Tony, and it was sort of quite overwhelming. And it felt like, as somebody who is outside of that community, and it sort of felt like it included everybody. It's sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like some doors were just opened and anybody was invited in who wanted to be part of that.
Yeah, and he seemed like in later years became, quite generous with himself and new players, and he did take on a much more enveloping, I guess, is that the right word? Enveloping role, whatever. Is that the right inclusive role with people? It seemed like he seemed to get more outgoing in later years.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. I mean, just the whole. I think that's why doing things like this is so interesting, because everybody has questions. Everybody sort of, like, I started this process feeling like I was talking to the people who knew the answers, and actually I'm just talking to people who have some other questions
that don't have the answers either.
So that everybody's got a question. Everybody's like, feels like they didn't know him as well as they would have liked to, or didn't get to spend as much time with him as they would have liked to. And it's been a joy and an honor to talk to people about him, really.
Well, thank you so much.
My next guest is Bryan Sutton, who is, like a absolute authority on all things bluegrass guitar related, but also a huge Tony Rice fan, and has taken Tony's spot in some of those instances where Tony couldn't tour with Bella Fleck, for example, or when Bella's wanted a rhythm guitar player since, and he's maybe got a unique position to appreciate some of this, but he's also just a passionate Tony Rice fan and an all-round lovely guy, and full of insight, and just a treat to talk to, as always. Here's Bryan Sutton.
Well, for me, even as a guy I was fortunate to be around Tony and also continue to be around a lot of people that played with Tony, but yet Church Street Blues as kind of this, more solo effort. I mean, Wyatt played on a couple of tracks, and I had a good chance to talk with him last year about some of that. But, as kind of a fan and kind of guitar nerd and Tony Rice, diehard, I've always asked the questions of J.D. Crowe and Doyle Lawson and Todd Phillips about the Bluegrass Album Band, or Bela Fleck about the Cold on the Shoulder record, or Sam Bush about the Manzanita record, and gotten lots of great, just questions answered and information about that kind of stuff. But Church Street Blues, as, again, kind of this island of just solo playing as far as the other recordings, I tend to remain just as much of a fan as anything. When I was around Tony, I tended to not inquire so much about things like that. I just didn't want to sort of push that too much of that around him personally, of just trying to say, okay, I'm around you, leave me all this, information, even though I wanted to kind of gurm as much as I could. But anyway, all that to say, yeah, I mean, it just, Church Street Blues for me kind of remains as, this sort of go-to kind of source for who Tony Rice was as a musician. Again, not just a player, but a singer, kind of a song interpreter, an arranger. Just to hear one human do so much, create so much of a musical sort of completeness. That's what I'm always been drawn to, musicians that just with their own, whatever they can do in one setting, stand with an instrument, sing, whatever it is. But for me, at least, I don't miss Sam Bush or Jerry Douglas or any of these other people on that record. It's amazing, I guess, all that to say, how to, within the whole scope of Tony's recorded work, how that continues to be like the strongest thing, not just, there's this little side project he did on his own. I mean, it is as strong as Manzanita or any of the other, full band works. And again, I think for most bluegrassers, it is more about the ensemble, and we all kind of play solo less. And so I think the mystery of that, again, the strength of it, when I say, it's a source that I go to like, again, how can I be motivated to kind of find my own version of that on occasion? And again, I find myself going to it. When Tony passed away, it was the first thing I listened to, just because it feels like so much of that core essence of who he was.
And it's a remarkable thing because, most of the people I've talked to about Tony over the past couple of years have talked about Tony as a reactive musician, as a listener, as a responder to what the people were doing. And on that record, apart from, as you say, a few bits with Wyatt, there's nobody there to respond to. And what you hear is such an extraordinary sound, particularly on tracks like Church Street Blues or Streets of London or One More Night, where Tony's playing this mixture of rhythm and melody and just a complete, it's wizardry almost.
Yeah. I mean, I've known that. I guess I never thought about it in that particular context, but yeah, like he would never even talk about rhythm guitar a lot of times, just because, it's like it depends on what JD does. That's what I do, is listen and react, and yeah, I mean, it's neat to think of him kind of composing these arrangements and using the instrument kind of as the complete band, and I wonder how much of a challenge it was for him, as such a reaction-based kind of musician. But again, because he did it, a guy like me can come along and say, yes, it can be done. And I mean, he wasn't the first, solo guitar player singer, but just the way he did it with such intricacy and power and fullness, like he didn't just sort of back into, I'll just strum along behind this lyric. It was so deep, so deep what he was doing.
And maybe what we're hearing there is just Tony, in the absence of other people to react to, just reacting to the song, reacting to the lyric. And that's what he's interacting with, rather than people, just because the setting of those songs, the choice of the songs, but also the setting of the songs is remarkable.
Yeah, it truly is. I think Tony, even to the day he died, would listen to lots of singers, lots of songwriters. Again, he cut a lot of Gordon Lightfoot songs, Bob Dylan, Randy Newman, Ian Tyson. And, he, as deep as he was, as any of us are, kind of as, guitar players and studiers of one thing or another, guitar based, that's another layer for me, especially as a session musician, that I've really gleaned from Tony. Just that here's listening to a song, here's backing a singer, and how to really, support at least to your interpretation, how to really support the song, not shy away from it or feel like I just need to kind of, get out of the way of it, but really kind of engage with it. I think that's what he does with his guitar and all those songs on Church Street Blues, is really weave the guitar into the emotional aspect of the tune. And then certainly just his capacity to do that, to pull all that off, it's like a feat of humanity. To, his Church Street Blues playing is something that's, it's still this high watermark for people that can even come close to kind of reproducing it.
Yeah, I remember quite strongly sort of sitting down and watching it and sort of being able to understand what was happening on each given note, and thinking that was enough to be able to then sit down and start to attempt to play it. And there's just nothing. It's understanding what he is doing and having any concept of being able to replicate that are two entirely different things.
Yeah. And I love too, just as you say that, I mean, and thinking about, again, his time with J.D. Crowe and as down the pike kind of hardcore bluegrass as he could be. And then you just get this complete sort of 180 side of this, almost kind of classical piano intricacy and this rolling supportive sound that's just, I mean, again, it will forever be like in the realm of what's possible on the guitar. It's always going to be a mountain to climb to achieve what he did, and the fact that it's not, Freeborn Man or Roll 'Em in Sweet Baby's Arms or something like that, which again is great, but just I love the fact that he has such a breadth in his either abilities on the guitar or again to the human side of it, to the willingness to know that again this shouldn't sound like just boom chuck strumming, and it can be intricate, it can be thoughtful and deep musically, and just the way those chords wind around. It's just that's a true inspiration for any of us that kind of come into or come out of bluegrass and work into other styles and things like that. And it really, I mean, you can't say enough about, again, him as a player, but to the human of it, just as a song interpreter and what he was able to figure out, how he was able to adjust one thing or another. And again, with this record, you just get a whole project based of that. It wasn't just a one-off. It wasn't just the one song. It's, it's different scenes, different feels, and just, I don't know. It certainly is, like I say, this complete source, continues to be a source every time I listen to it for inspiration and kind of centering. That's one of the things I said when he passed away with that. And Manzanita, too, to be honest. It's just like there's this kind of musical compass that gets centered when I listen to those records.
And we haven't even mentioned the singing in amongst all of that. And the singing is also, as an album of guitar playing, if he'd played guitar and somebody else had sung, it would still be an extraordinary thing. But to do those two together, because the singing on that album is great as well.
Yeah, it's again, as a guy that's come into that a little later in my sort of musical career, that's just another element of a challenge for me as a primary guitar player to, again, kind of like I was saying earlier, not in the interest of singing, kind of dumb the guitar down or oversimplify it, but to really engage deeply with both. I think, again, that's what makes that so special, is you get such a personal, again, solo performance of great playing and great singing. And again, I think about, some of the great, like either jazz pianists that have done similar things with just kind of really checking those boxes in a strong way, vocally and instrumentally at the same time. I also think about, some of my continued favorites in that world, like Daryl Scott, Tim O'Brien, that are just for one musician with an instrument and a voice can create so much music and so much completeness where, you don't miss any other element. It's all there. It's all you need.
Next, we've got Chris Eldridge from Punch Brothers and Mighty Poplar. Chris knew Tony as a kid because Tony was around the Seldom scene, the band that Chris's dad was in, but also Chris, as a student, spent some time with Tony talking about music and having conversations about what it means to be a musician and a guitarist, and has some really interesting insights. And again, incredibly warm and generous and just fun to chat to. Here comes Chris.
I don't remember talking to him about that record very much. What I remember talking to him about was that he had the idea that he wanted to do the record, and he was on Rounder at the time, and Rounder didn't think that he should do that. He was kind of making his instrumental Spacegrass records then, and they just had a different ideas about what he was going to do. And I presume Tony was fully under contract, but this is where Tony just had such a maverick. Tony was going to do what Tony was going to do, and so he was like, "All right, sure, don't put it out." And he just went to Sugar Hill and called them up and said, "I want to make this record." Basically, Tony was like, "Nobody is going to tell me what kind of music I'm going to make." So for whatever reason, he arrived at this point where he wanted to make that record at that time. And it was almost, from a business side, I think it was almost defiant in how he did it. He was just going to do what he was going to do. Which says something about Tony for sure. I also know that was a very difficult record for him to make. I think being so exposed, so naked, and having to create the whole musical picture was something that he had to work on a lot. But he sure did succeed. As you listen to that record, I popped it on and just skipped around a little bit this morning just because I knew we were going to be talking, just because it had been a little while since I listened to it. And I was struck. I was just struck with how big a lot of the gestures are on that record. We can, it's so easy to, fixate on how accurate and precise Tony is and how complex, the lines are that he plays on the guitar. Think about the song Church Street Blues and that. It's really syncopated. There are all these crazy things going on. But I think if you listen to Church Street Blues, you can also really hear how zoomed out he notes. Like you can hear these really big phrases. You hear that he wasn't just operating in this really zoomed in microscopic way. You can really hear. I think it's kind of a masterclass if you choose to look for this stuff in rendering music and having a big picture. Holding both a big picture in mind and kind of a focused, more microscopic picture. I think that's probably when, he said it was hard. I think that's probably what he was working on was how do you get not just the guitar playing to sound awesome and the singing to sound awesome, but how do you get like a whole musical world to come through and that has dimensionality to it? Because I think that's why Church Street Blues is such a masterpiece. I mean, as a fan of Tony Rice's, study it and just try and learn about how he was doing what he was doing, which is something I'll always be fascinated by. But it's this record that just stands up as a good record to listen to. And I think if you kind of start asking yourself why or how that's happening, I think it's, I think it's because he had a bigger perspective. There's a lot of the wisdom of Tony. Tony was such a wise guy, wise musician. This is something that kind of I was so struck by in my time with him. My big takeaway was how wise he was, not how good or talented or anything like that. My big takeaway was always how wise he was. He's like, a sage who was like sitting on top of the mountain. And we talked a lot from that perspective. He talked to me a lot from that perspective as the guy, like, sitting on top of the mountain. And there was a lot of asking questions about the big picture. So he was very concerned with that sort of thing. And I think the Church Street Blues is a fascinating listen with that in mind.
And it's really interesting that as you were describing that, it's almost like I get a similar sense if I stand in front of one of those big bits of street art that takes up the entire side of a building, but is incredibly detailed. And you think when you're painting like a square foot of that, how do you know what it looks like from 30 feet back? And how are the proportions going to be right? And how are the lines going to settle, not just across a phrase or a verse or a song, but a whole record and a whole musical kind of intent across 40 minutes of, and it has that. It hangs together as an album. It begs to be listened to together.
Exactly. I wonder about that often in that exact same way. I see, in Nashville, there's some murals, like some big murals, and they're so beautiful and detailed. It's like how are these guys doing? How are they operating on both levels? And I mean, I can't. I'm the world's worst visual artist, so that truly boggles my mind. But I think it's probably the same as music. You just kind of have to remember to do that. That's part of the task. As you practice the songs, you record them and you go back and listen to them and you see, is it coming through? You just try and keep that bigger perspective in mind. I mean, even I was listening to, what song was it? It's Last Thing on My Mind. Earlier today, I just kind of dropped the needle on that one, and I was just struck with how big the beats were. Like they're these kind of big phrases in how he's playing it on guitar. You hear these in the guitar playing, like, or just the big musical phrases wind up being a lot bigger. There's so much little stuff happening in there. But the big phrases kind of have these beautiful turns in them as well. It's really cool. It's just so easy to lose sight of that. I mean, I think that's kind of what I mean about the wisdom. Tony was so wise, and I think if you listen to some of this music with that in mind, you can kind of hear that he was remembering the big picture.
Yeah, and when you're responsible for singing and playing the guitar and nobody else is doing anything and the arrangements are as complicated as Church Street Blues or whatever in terms of technical stuff that's going on, to be zoomed out enough to trust all that's going to happen and still deliver a performance is like, that's about as good as it gets.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I think with any of that stuff, you kind of you just work on it. You keep working on it, and then you keep working on it. And at a certain point, you just turn it over and you just trust that it's going to be there. It's mysterious and it's not mysterious all at the same time. It's like you can marvel at somebody doing that, but I feel like anybody who's accomplished great things like that, for me as a practitioner, it's always fun to just remember that, like, well, these guys got there by just doing the work. There's no other way. Like, as much as I revere Tony, for instance, he also showed up to where he was by just working really hard and just loving it so much, staying so committed and keeping, orienting his priorities and his interests around that, making sure he could be that guy who could spend that time on that stuff.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. That's another thing. Yeah.
I was watching some tennis last year, and Roger Federer was playing, and the commentator basically said, like, he makes this thing look effortless, but you have no idea how much effort goes into making something look that effortless. It's like, it's the hours and hours and hours of hitting the same shot over and over again. And, but as an outsider who can't do that, it looks like some sort of magic. And I guess the magic is being the kind of creative mind that decides to do it in the first place. That's the magic. And the rest of it is just teaching your body to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you go far enough in one direction, you end up in the other.
That's right. That's totally right.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because it's one of the words that's cropped up quite a lot when people talk about Church Street Blues has been the word intimate, because it is a very intimate listening experience, because you're just hearing Tony and you're hearing all the like little inner workings of what goes on. But also what you say about the bigger phrases and the bigger arc of it, and like, it's really interesting that it has both of those facets. It's intimate and broad at the same time.
Yeah, well, I feel like the big picture is only something I've come to appreciate recently. Like, I feel like the intimate thing, I've always, you're struck by that immediately, because you don't often get to hear Tony Rice so unadorned. You often hear the effect of Tony Rice. In most of his recorded output, he's playing with a band, and what a lot of people are so blown away by with Tony is how he could affect and shape the music going on around him. It's not just him taking great guitar solos. It's just that everybody played their best when they played with Tony. The music that he was a part of, like when the music he was a part of was hitting its stride. All music hits its stride, whatever it is. But when Tony was around and the music hit its stride, it really is like legendary stuff. It feels monumental in those moments. And so, looking at that, it's like you feel the effect of Tony. But it's often hard in those things to kind of listen through and actually hear. You say, like, how's he doing that? You can't always hear the nuances of how his guitar is interacting with the band. Sometimes you can, and it's fun to listen to any kind of band record with him with that in mind. I mean, but on Church Street Blues, it's like this amazing example. It's like everybody's like, oh, okay, finally I'm going to get to hear like how he's doing it all. And it really is cool to hear him play rhythm guitar on there and hear how little he's actually playing, so much of the time. There's not a lot of strumming on that record. There are a lot of kind of bass lines that dance and little phrases that'll dance kind of, but it's always in dialogue with the vocal. It's not just like don jaga don jaga don jaga da. It's you kind of get this interesting inner look that you just can't see, this view you can't usually see of kind of the relationship between his singing and the songs and his guitar playing. That's just so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And that thing you talk about the like playing very little and almost just playing bass lines at points, and it's a bit more like a jazz approach to playing a drum kit than a rock approach to playing a kit, where like with jazz you've got the ride cymbal and the hi-hat going all the time, and then everything else comes in between phrases to comment or accent, or it's like the strums with Tony are often only there between phrases as like a little bit of punctuation, or it's not there all the time. He's not driving his way through all of it. And it's great to be able to just hear that sometimes and notice it.
Totally.
It's there, but when you listen to a 5-piece band where everybody's playing incredibly, some of that goes under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's the Tony Rice Jedi mind trick. He trusted his listeners to kind of fill in some of the gaps. He didn't feel like he needed to show you where every single thing was. Like, there was a thread he was connected to that thread. He stayed connected to it, didn't need to spell it all out for you. And he did that in such a powerful, committed way that you as the listener find that thread too, without even realizing you're doing it. And you can fill in the gaps. You don't need him to hit every single subdivision. You don't need him to hit every single strum. It is interesting. I mean, I love I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think it's pretty apt, the comparison between like rock and roll, which is, in the most beautiful way, because I love rock and roll, just so boneheaded. It's like, you're going to, like, the rhythm's going to kind of hit you there. Dugga, 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 dugga. Yeah. Versus the jazz thing where it just floats and everybody's kind of in this land of, where, I don't know, it's like you're on the ocean or something. It's just all a little bit suspended, but you're moving forward.
And I also asked Chris the question about first hearing this record, because unlike some of the people I've interviewed, he wasn't around when the record came out and wouldn't have remembered the release. He'd have been, a year old or so. I asked him, when he first became aware of Church Street Blues.
Yeah, I'm an 82 model myself, but it was definitely, that record was definitely in my house a lot. My mom is, the world's biggest Tony Rice fan. She just loved that music so much and loved Tony's thing so much, like a lot of people. She's not a flat picker. Tony his heart was there. And so that was a record we definitely listened to when I was a kid. It's interesting. I'd encourage people to find it on vinyl and try and listen to it and all of Tony's records. Find it on vinyl. It sounds so much better than the digital transfers. There's a lot of music that sounds better on digital. I feel like the vast majority of music made today, if it's recorded digitally, it's almost always going to sound better digitally. I certainly feel that way about all the music I've ever made that's gone on a record. It's like the digital copy sounds better. But with music that was recorded back in the day, it's the opposite. It's like, to hear this stuff on vinyl is really the way it's meant to be heard. So for anybody out there who's got a turntable, and at this point, $100 to spend on eBay. Yeah. I guess I'm saying that, and it's realizing like it's hard to find those things now, but it really is worth hearing on vinyl.
I don't know if it was you who said this, but I remember somebody telling me at some point that that Tony would urge people to find the vinyl as well, because he wasn't particularly happy with some of the transfers to CD, that he didn't think they'd be done particularly thoughtfully.
I didn't realize that I just grew up listening to the CDs. Well, I guess I had some tapes when I was a kid. I had like Me and My Guitar on cassette. I remember, but yeah, like when I was kind of getting into it, I had all this stuff on CD, and it was actually when I was down at his house, he was like, "Have you ever heard this stuff on vinyl?" He wasn't a big fan of playing his own music. He wasn't like there to toot his own horn, but I think he did want me to know about that. So I remember he put on acoustics. He pulled out his record Acoustics and put that on the vinyl. And it was like, and I knew that record inside and out. I knew every note that everybody played on it. I'd listened to it a lot. And it was like hearing it for the first time, hearing it on vinyl. He also had a great system, but that was, it was interesting. I know I may have told you this little story before, but apparently when they heard the digital, he and Billy Wolf heard the digital, master of Cold on the Shoulder. It was so bad to their ears that they laughed. They weren't even upset. They were just like, it was so far off of what they had intended it to be and what it was kind of on the vinyl, just really thin. And so yeah, for people who haven't heard like the original versions as they actually made them and oversaw them, because they didn't oversee, with a couple of rare exceptions where Billy remastered some of that stuff, they didn't oversee any of the digital transfers. It was just Rounder sent it all off to, I think there was some mastering house in Japan that just kind of they'd send them off and they just kind of process these things. And that's what we all grew up with, and which is great. It doesn't take anything away from the music. It's just it's a beautiful experience awaiting people who haven't heard the other versions.
My last guest in this episode is Caroline Wright, who co-wrote Still Inside, the Tony Rice story with Tim Stafford, and she spent some time on the road with Tony, sort of preparing for that. I'm so glad I got to talk to Caroline. We had 4 attempts at it. One, I messed up the time zones. Caroline's in Hawaii, I'm in London. The clocks changed and my brain couldn't cope. Second time, Caroline was busy, had to cancel. Third time, we thought we got it nailed, and then we had some tech problems. And the fourth time, we finally managed it. I'm so glad we did, because it was just a lovely conversation, and I think a beautiful, reflective chat to end this first episode on. It was just a joy to get to talk to her. Here comes Caroline Wright.
I don't remember when I first heard it. Because it seems always to have been part of my life, as most of Tony's music. I grew up listening to Tony Rice. My parents were founders of the Adirondack Bluegrass League, and so I went to festivals from a young age and saw Tony with J.D. Crowe at the Corinth Bluegrass Festival, and just in a lot of incarnations. My mother actually promoted a show with him. And there was never a time that he wasn't part of my life, or his music wasn't part of my life. So that's my answer.
It must have been amazing then to sort of finally get to work with Tony on the book.
It was definitely, because he'd been part of my life as a child, and then getting to know him as an adult and as a human being, with all his flaws and the miraculous things about him. It changed a lot of my own thinking about what it must be like to be a working touring bluegrass musician, of course, because I'd never done anything like that. I'd never been on the road with a musician, but it was something I was intrigued about. I was intrigued about how people live when they're off stage and what they do and what their interests are, because people who play bluegrass, as Tony was, they're often, I don't know, preternaturally talented. There's so much talent in this genre, so much incredible musical talent in this genre, that, I find it intriguing to learn about their hobbies and their interests, because Tony and his accutrons, good heavens. And so many of his peers obviously have become fascinated and interested in accutrons, but Tony was also, he was fascinated by particle physics, and really he was curious about a lot of things, as I think so many of his really talented peers are, so that was one of the things that really hit home with me, was there's way more layers than one might expect, so.
Yeah. And that sort of getting to spend that sort of time, like in a car, going to a festival or going to a show with him, and seeing that sort of quiet time when he's not in the public eye is, presumably a fascinating experience.
It was. We laughed a lot. He was funny as hell. He really was. He liked jokes, and he knew some salty ones. And he just, it was fun to travel with him, and comfortable. I thought I'd be I thought I'd be a little uneasy or on edge the whole time because, it was a strange process. And I actually recorded as we drove. Not all the time, but I did. And, but it was really easy. We developed a good rapport. And I went on the road with him a couple times. I was in 2003 and then in 2005. And, it was really interesting to see how people reacted to him. Even if they didn't know exactly who he was, they knew he was somebody, because of the way he carried himself. And, he was impeccably dressed, even when it was just in jeans. The jeans were creased and the shirt was a silk shirt, and he was impeccable no matter what. And that dignity, the Southern gentleman dignity that he had, it was old world. It was not something you see so much anymore, except in a lot of bluegrass musicians. They seem to carry that still, a lot of them. Yeah.
And there's something about that sort of that immaculateness that kind of crosses over into these conversations about Church Street Blues, because like one of the things people remark about it when we talk about it is just how in place everything is on that record, and how perfect it is, even though perfect is not what's great about it. It is perfect and just so detailed and so incredible a record, but also very, very intimate, and for people like me who didn't meet Tony, it feels like that's the closest I'm going to get to spending a bit of time with him.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good observation. It is intimate. That's a great description for that recording. You must be aware of the new release from Acoustic Disc with Wyatt and Tony.
Yeah,
it's very exciting. Have you heard any of that?
Yeah, and some of the unit records as well that they've been putting out recently, they're so good. But yeah, that one where it's just Tony and Wyatt, you don't get to hear that much, and it's just delightful. No,
it really is. It really is. It is a lot like being in the same room. That's really good description. Yeah, and I love that recording. Church Street Blues is just, I have some friends who do it. I can't listen to that without crying a little bit. It's even now, it's hard, even all this time on. I mean, this is the first interview I've done with anybody really about Tony. So it's still a little rough. I'm sure it is for a lot of people who cared about him and who cared about his music,
Yeah, and just that sense that I get from people that even though Tony hadn't been sort of in the public eye or performing, the possibility of that was still there. And losing that possibility was one of the things that hit people as much as anything. Just that, even though he hadn't been around that much, there was always still a chance that there'd be a new record or some shows, or the chance to hear him sing again or play again. And
he always talked about it, Matt. He talked about how his heroes, had resurrections late in life, had risen from the ashes like phoenixes. And, I think he was always hoping that he could do that too, that he could find a way back to do that, and how sad for us that he never did. I can't remember who wrote it, but he was such a perfectionist about his music that I think it pained him very much that he couldn't produce the perfection that he'd become known for, or the speed, or he didn't have that technique in his later years. And how sad for him and for all of us that, maybe he thought that was his worth, that nobody would want to hear him slowed down or make a mistake. Do you remember the recording that Dan Crary did. I think Jammed If I Do. He had it.
Oh,
It's
no,
a
I
bunch
don't know
of
that.
duos. It's a bunch of duet recordings with some of his favorite guitar players, and one of them is Tony. And at the beginning, he says, hey Tony, could you do me one favor when we play this song?" And Tony's like, "Sure, what's that, Dan?" And Dan says, "Could you just make a mistake, just one?" you know, I mean, and I think he was worried that he wouldn't find an audience for what he could offer in his later years, and that's too bad, because we all would have been there for whatever he could bring to the table. But again, that dignity, it's that sense of dignity that maybe he didn't. It was an unassailable dignity that he had, and maybe he just wasn't ready for that.
And if things being immaculate is important to you, like, you're always going to judge yourself more harshly than anybody else is ever going to judge you.
It's so true.
You've kind of got to feel comfortable with it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And, a little bit of deterioration is inevitable for all of us. It's the way of the world. I mean, I'm 58 now, and I see that in myself and in the people around me who are aging with me, my loved ones who are aging with me, but that said, gosh, the kapuna, as we call them here in Hawaii, the elders bring so much value to the table, even when their skills aren't quite up to par as they were in their 20s. They offer so much more, and yeah. So, I just, thank goodness we have Tony's recordings, and the ones that every now and then emerge from the back of a closet or something, the stuff that still comes out now and then and just takes our breath away and astonishes us anew. Wow.
I think that's one of the lovely things about acoustic music, sort of roots music, or like non-commercial music, really. So blues and folk and jazz and all of that, is people understand that if you've been doing it for 50 or 60 years, you've probably got something interesting to say that's worth hearing. Whereas in the world of pop music, if you're old, you're just old, unless you're the Rolling Stones, but they're sort of a separate story in their own right. But people accept with roots music that if you've been around a long time, you're going to be worth listening to. And it's not necessarily about the speed or perfection you had when you were young. It's just about having something to say. It's
true. Yeah. And, I think maybe a lot of older musicians, maybe get that, and some of them just, it's just hard to get past the perfection and whatever other demons they've got going, it's hard. Life in the public eye. I couldn't do it, Matt. I don't know how people do it. You really have to be very comfortable with yourself, and just, I mean, it just going on the road with him, it was kind of terrifying for somebody like me who is always behind the scenes, to see the way people react to somebody like that. And people always want something. They always want a little something, a little exchange, a little, a little something. And, for somebody who is shy or, likes privacy, I can see where that would be tough.
Yeah. And I guess people who want something would often see it as a little thing and not see the price that it costs the person to give it. They think, oh, it's,
right,
an autograph or a smile or a quick chat or,
anything.
But
yeah.
No, it's so true. And the way you're talking about that, it's such a funny balance of being an artist and having a thin enough skin to be vulnerable and communicate something, because that's what we want, and a thick enough skin to cope with how the world deals with you. It's such a fine balance.
And it's interesting too. Bluegrass music has changed. I'm going to say that over the years. It was really funny. I did an interview with Katie Daly and Tom Minty for our podcast, and we talked about a fantasy bluegrass festival, and they talked about bluegrass festivals of old where artists were really super accessible, and they would go out into the crowd and jam, into the campground and jam, and that did happen a lot. I remember that. I grew up with that. In fact, one of my favorite Tony Rice stories, I was at Gray Fox in New York. And this was, I was in my 20s. I was pretty young and out in a field with my sister and a few other people. And we were sitting around a lantern, passing around a bottle of wine and singing songs. And we found some lovely 3-part harmony, and not on bluegrass music because we didn't all share the same bluegrass. So we found something by Crosby, Stills and Nash and started singing that. And there's this figure in the shadows comes walking up with another person arm in arm. And it was Tony, and he stood there and listened for a few minutes and said, "That was mighty fine, girls, keep it up." It was just, and that was, I wish I'd been able to sing with him, Matt. I've since found my voice, I guess, as a bluegrass singer. I sing a little bit only in jams, but I wish I'd been able to sing with him. Isn't that a funny thing?
Yeah.
Mm.
There's a certain kind of communication that happens through music that,
Mm-hmm.
Is its own thing.
And I asked him, even when we were traveling, I asked him if he had a list of songs that he might sing, if he were able to again. And I think always in the back of his mind, he had something germinating, So
yeah, I mean that's one of the things that not as not particularly a songwriter, but a collector of songs for his sort of voice.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big part of what Tony did as a singer, was just to collect various songs together that he could do something with.
Yeah, and his interpretation of them was just, I think it's going to rain today. I mean, how unlikely for him to cover that song, but how beautiful and effective, and I mean, what a beautiful interpretation of that tune. I just, that's when I think about. And one of my very favorites is "Don't Let Your Deal Go Down." Have you heard that? On Tony Trishka's what is it, Banjoland album. And as Tony Trishka told me, Tony was kind of losing his voice and reluctant to sing that, but it's a brilliant, I mean, it's just so good. It's so good. I don't listen to that if you have a chance. Yeah, that's I love to talk about his music. It's just, as I said, it's such a part of my life. It's like sharing my favorite books, or, here, try this dish. It's bluegrass.
You were saying earlier that you find Church Street Blues hard to listen to now. Is it that specific record, or is it sort of all of Tony's music now?
That's the song, specifically Church Street Blues. It always makes me a little misty. But there's, there are other tunes of his that are like that. California Autumn, always, California Autumn. I remember when I was a 10, 12-year-old kid, just that was what I listened to. That was I guess other kids were listening to Mother Goose or something, and that I was in love with that album. I grew up in a household that didn't have a bunch of money, so I listened to that, and I listened to Mr. Poverty, that Larry Rice wrote, which is a very sad song. And it just, that all spoke to me as a little kid, made me want to write, made me want to, as Alison said, Alison Krauss talked about just having a picture of the kind of man that Tony was. And I guess I can understand that, because I that resonates with me. His music just painted pictures. It just painted such vivid pictures for a little kid, a little girl that I was, little girl from a kind of a crazy family, So, yeah. And I think, I've talked to so many people whose lives his music has changed, whose lives his music has saved. How crazy is that, Matt, to be somebody whose life was saved by somebody's music,
Mm.
And there's more than one. That happens, that we got a lot of stories like that when we were collecting stories for this book, and I think there's a lot of them out there that we haven't even heard, So, and what about you? See, I want to ask you how you found Tony's. I want to interview the interviewer.
I just sort of, years ago, I've been a musician for most of my life, started out as a drummer, but I left a job maybe nearly 20 years ago, and they bought me a mandolin as a leaving present. And so I started
much
learning
better
to play
than a gold watch. That's so much better.
Exactly. And I started learning to play it, and then I already knew a bit of bluegrass and a bit of sort of country and old time, and just, I guess, dug into the bluegrass a bit more. And then it was one of those things, you pull on a string and you keep pulling, and then I bought some compilation CD, I can't remember what it was, and it had on it, which Tony track was it? It was I've Waited as Long as I Can.
Oh.
And I was just like, that is fantastic. Who's this dude? And then just, went off finding Tony Rice.
Wow. And you never looked back.
And I think for me, like amongst all of it, Church Street Blues is the record that is the one that I go back to and go back to and go back to, because it's just got a bit of everything. Like I love hearing Tony play fast, bluesy breaks on, breakneck songs, but I love him doing that thing that he does when he's playing on his own. It's just like almost like a whole band with one guitar, and this voice over the top of it, and it's just such a, I don't know, it's so wraps itself around you, like from every angle. It's like, it's like a hug.
I always think of it as water, because I love, I live in Hawaii, so I love snorkeling, and it just, for me, it's like being, I don't know, it's being flowed around and embraced by something warm and, I don't know, just seamless and timeless and just ever flowing. It just flows. All these words, they seem so inadequate. And I say that as a wordsmith. It's like, I've never found words to be able to accurately describe, but water, the water moving, water flowing is how I always think of his playing. And, yeah, that's interesting. And, he was great with the lightning fast stuff, but I love his slower playing. I do. I love the slower stuff. I love the more intimate stuff, I love it all. It's really, and I miss him, and I wish he were still here to share his music with us,
And that's it for this first episode. There is a second episode that I'm going to put out in a week with some fantastic people in it as well. Marcel Ardans from the Lessons with Marcel channel talks about transcribing Tony's music. I talked to Jake Heddy, to Bob Minner. There's a lot of good stuff to come in part two. Things about where Tony's influence has gone, how he's influenced a bunch of players, people talking about his guitar style. There's some great conversations to come. There's a lot left of this celebration of Church Street Blues, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you next week. But that's it for now. I'll see you next time. Happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.